She stepped off the train knowing she was the wrong bride, knowing the man waiting for her had been promised someone prettier, softer, easier to love. But instead of pretending, instead of hiding behind a lie that could buy her comfort, she walked straight toward him and told the truth. And what the cowboy said next would change the course of both their lives. The morning the decision was made, Eliza Boone stood in the doorway of her family's crumbling farmhouse, flowers still dusting her hands, as her father avoided her eyes, and her younger sister Clara smoothed the silk ribbon in her hair, like she had already stepped into a better life. The letter from the West lay open on the table, its ink still bold with promise, a ranch, land, stability, a husband named Caleb Rourke who had paid good money for a bride willing to come out and build a life beside him. But Clara had no intention of going, not now that a merchant's son had taken an interest in her, not now that comfort sat within reach. And Eliza didn't need the words spoken aloud to understand what came next, because she had always been the one chosen for the harder path, the one built for work instead of admiration, the one who knew how to carry more than her share without complaint. "He won't mind," Clara said lightly, as if they were discussing a misplaced parcel instead of a human life. Men like that don't care who shows up as long as she can cook and keep house. And Eliza felt something sharp twist in her chest. Not anger exactly, but a quiet, steady realization that she was being sent not as a bride, but as a substitute, a solution to a problem no one else wanted to face. Her father cleared his throat, muttering something about opportunity and survival, about how the rancher had written he needed a strong woman, and Eliza let the silence stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable before she spoke, her voice calm in a way that surprised even her. "I'll go," she said, and both of them looked up in relief so immediate it almost stung. But she wasn't finished. "I'll go as myself, and I'll tell him the truth the moment I arrive." Because if she was being sent into the unknown, she would at least arrive there with her dignity intact, and that decision carried her through the long, rattling train ride west where the land stretched wider with every mile and the air grew sharper, filled with the scent of dust and possibility, and where whispers among passengers painted Caleb Rourke as a man carved out of storms, a former gunman turned rancher, a man who kept to himself, a man others respected but did not cross, and each story should have frightened her more than the last. But instead it steadied something inside her because she understood, perhaps better than most, what it meant to be shaped by hardship rather than broken by it. By the time the train pulled into the small, windswept station at the edge of Wyoming territory, Eliza's nerves had settled into something like resolve, and when she stepped down onto the platform, her worn boots hitting unfamiliar ground, she saw him immediately, standing apart from the others as though the crowd itself had learned to give him space, tall and still beneath a wide-brimmed hat, his coat dusted with travel, and his gaze fixed on every woman who descended from the train with a kind of measured expectation that tightened Eliza's chest because she knew, without question, that he was looking for someone else. She could have turned away then, could have delayed the moment, could have let him believe for just a few minutes longer that the promise he'd paid for was about to be fulfilled, but she didn't, because she had come too far to start with a lie. So she lifted her chin, squared her shoulders, and walked straight toward him, each step echoing louder in her ears than the bustle of the station, until she stopped just a few feet away and said, "Mr. Rourke," and his eyes settled on her with a quiet intensity that made it clear he missed very little. "You're early," he said, his voice low and even, as though testing the sound of her before accepting it. And Eliza swallowed once, steadying herself. "My name is Eliza Boone," she replied, watching as a flicker of confusion crossed his face because that was not the name he had been given, not the name he had written letters to for months, and she didn't let the silence stretch too long before continuing. "The woman you were expecting, my sister, she isn't coming." And there it was, laid bare between them with no attempt to soften it, no attempt to make it easier, just the truth in its simplest form. The noise of the station seemed to fade for a moment as Caleb studied her, his gaze moving over her not in appraisal of beauty, but in quiet assessment, as though he were measuring something deeper, something less easily defined. "Then why are you here?" he asked, and Eliza met his eyes without flinching. "Because someone had to come," she said, "and I won't pretend to be anyone else." And for a long moment, he said nothing at all, the wind tugging at the edge of his coat while the last of the passengers drifted away, leaving them standing alone in the settling dust, and she braced herself for rejection, for the inevitable dismissal that would send her back east with nothing but the weight of failure pressing down on her shoulders. But instead, Caleb let out a slow breath and reached for the small satchel at her feet, lifting it as though the decision had already been made somewhere deep inside him. "You came all this way just to tell me that?" he asked, and there was something in his tone now, something almost like curiosity. "Yes," Eliza answered simply, and that seemed to settle it because he nodded once, a small, decisive movement that carried more weight than any long speech could have. "Then you've got more honesty than most," he said, before turning toward the line of horses tied nearby. "Town's no place to linger," he added, almost as an afterthought, and when she didn't move. Immediately, he glanced back at her with the faintest hint of something unreadable in his expression. "You can ride with me," he said. "But understand this. I don't make promises I don't intend to keep, and I don't keep ones that were made under false pretenses." Eliza stepped forward then, her heart pounding not with fear, but with the strange, unfamiliar feeling of standing on the edge of something entirely new. "I'm not asking for promises," she replied, and for the briefest moment, something shifted in his gaze, something that looked almost like respect. "Good," Caleb said, handing her the reins of a steady-looking mare, "because I'm not offering any, not yet." And as she mounted the horse and fell in a step beside him, leaving the station and everything familiar behind, Eliza Boone realized that she had not been sent west to replace someone else after all. She had been sent there to prove, to him and perhaps even to herself, that the truth, spoken at the right moment, could change everything. The first week on Caleb Rourke's ranch made one thing painfully clear. This was no place for someone who wanted an easy life, and Eliza Boone knew from the moment she stepped onto the dry, wind-cut land that whatever chance she had here would have to be earned the hard way, not given. The house itself stood strong against the horizon, built of thick timber and stubborn will, but everything around it told a different story. Fences sagging under neglect, tools left where they'd last been dropped, dust settling thick across the porch like time had simply stopped caring, and Caleb wasted no words welcoming her, only gesturing once toward the land and saying, "This is what you came for," before turning back to his work as though her presence was just another uncertainty to be measured. But Eliza didn't hesitate, because she hadn't come all that way to stand still, and by the second morning she was already moving through the house like she belonged there, scrubbing floors, airing out rooms, setting order to chaos with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent her whole life making do with less. And it didn't take long for the rhythm of the ranch to settle around her. Long days, longer silences, and the constant awareness that she was being watched, not in suspicion, but in evaluation, like Caleb was still deciding if she was worth the trouble of keeping. The only one who spoke freely was Luke Mercer, Caleb's right-hand man, a sharp-eyed cowboy with an easy grin and a habit of leaning just a little too close when he talked, the kind of man who filled every silence Caleb left behind. And from the moment he met Eliza, he made his interest known in the most effortless way possible, offering help she didn't ask for, telling stories she didn't need, and smiling like he already knew how things would end. "You don't have to prove anything to him, you know," Luke said one afternoon as they stood by the well, handing her a bucket she had already been reaching for. "Men like Caleb, they don't change their minds easy." And Eliza met his gaze calmly. "I didn't come here to change his mind," she replied, lifting the bucket without his help. "I came here to show him who I am." And something in her tone made Luke pause, just long enough for her to walk past him without another word. But it wasn't just the house she worked on. Eliza paid attention to everything. The way supplies seemed to run low faster than they should. The way certain tools went missing only to reappear days later. The way Caleb's quiet frustration grew sharper with each passing day as small problems stacked into larger ones. And when she brought it up to him one evening over supper, his reaction was immediate but controlled. "You think someone's stealing?" he asked, his gray eyes narrowing slightly, and Eliza didn't rush her answer. "I think something isn't right," she said, and that was enough for him, because from that night forward, the way he looked at her changed, not softer, not yet, but sharper, more attentive, like he was starting to see her as more than just a stand-in for a promise that had already been broken. Days turned into a week, and then 2. And slowly, the ranch began to shift under her hands. The kitchen became a place of warmth instead of neglect. The porch was cleared, the supplies accounted for, and even Caleb, though he said little, began to linger just a moment longer at the table after meals, as if the idea of leaving didn't come as easily as it once had. But just as that fragile sense of order began to take hold, the night everything changed arrived without warning. It started with the sound of hooves, too many, too fast, and by the time Eliza stepped outside, the darkness was already alive with movement, shadows cutting through the fields as cattle scattered in panic. "Raiders!" Luke shouted from across the yard, already reaching for his rifle, and Caleb was moving before the word fully settled, his voice cutting through the chaos with sharp, precise commands. But Eliza didn't freeze, didn't retreat. She ran toward the barn instead, grabbing the lantern and swinging it high, using the light to signal where the herd was breaking, her heart pounding as gunshots cracked through the night air, louder than anything she had ever known. And in the flicker of firelight and dust, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Not strangers moving through the chaos, but someone who knew the land too well, someone guiding the raiders instead of fighting them. The attack didn't last long, not with Caleb and his men pushing back hard, but when the dust settled and the cattle were rounded, the damage was done. Fences broken, supplies stolen, and the unmistakable truth hanging heavy in the air that this hadn't been random, it had been planned. And as Caleb stood in the middle of the yard, his jaw tight and his gaze dark, Eliza stepped beside him, her voice steady despite the storm still racing through her chest. "It's not just outsiders," she said quietly. "Someone here is helping them." And for the first time since she had arrived, Caleb didn't question her, didn't doubt her. He simply looked at her with something deeper than before, something that carried both trust and the weight of what that truth meant. "Then we find out who," he said, his voice low and dangerous. And as the wind carried the last echoes of the raid into the night, Eliza realized that whatever this trial had started as, it was no longer just about proving she belonged. It was about surviving something far more dangerous than either of them had expected. By the time the truth came to light, Eliza Boone was no longer the woman who had stepped off that train as the wrong bride. She had become something the land itself recognized, someone who stood her ground when things broke apart. And when the final betrayal revealed itself, it didn't come from a stranger in the dark, but from someone standing in plain sight all along. Luke Mercer didn't deny it when Caleb confronted him at sunrise, didn't even try to run, just gave that same easy smile as if this had all been inevitable, admitting he'd been feeding information to rival ranchers for months, waiting for the right moment to take what Caleb had built and claim a better deal for himself. "You were never meant to keep all this," Luke said, gesturing toward the land like it was already his. "Men like you don't get happy endings." And for a moment, the air between them turned razor sharp, the kind of silence that comes just before something breaks. But it wasn't Caleb who moved first. It was Eliza, stepping forward with a steadiness that surprised them both, her voice cutting clean through the tension. "You're wrong," she said, and Luke's grin faltered just enough to matter, because she wasn't speaking like someone caught in the middle anymore. She was speaking like someone who had chosen her side. "He built this," she continued, her eyes never leaving Luke's, "and I helped save it. And you don't get to take either." And something shifted then, something final, because this wasn't just about land or cattle anymore. It was about what had been fought for and what was worth keeping. And when Luke reached for his gun, it was Caleb who stepped between them, the standoff ending as quickly as it began when Daniel and the others closed in, leaving Luke outnumbered and out of chances, and by midday he was gone, driven off the land he thought he could steal, leaving behind nothing but dust and the hard lesson that betrayal doesn't always win. The days that followed were quieter, but not empty, because something had changed in the space between Eliza and Caleb, something that had been building since the moment she told him the truth. And that night, as the sun dipped low over the fields they had fought to protect, Caleb found her standing by the fence line, watching the cattle settle. "You could still leave," he said, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "Take your share, start somewhere easier." And Eliza turned to him slowly, a faint smile touching her lips. "I didn't come here for easy," she replied, echoing words that now meant something entirely different. And for a moment he just looked at her, like he was weighing something he had never dared to before finally stepping closer. "I asked for a bride once," he said. "Thought I knew what that meant." His gaze steady on hers. "But what I got was someone who stood beside me when it mattered." Eliza held his eyes, her voice soft but certain. "I didn't come here to be chosen," she said. "I came here to choose." And the silence that followed wasn't uncertain. It was full, complete, like the land after a storm finally settles. And when she reached for his hand, it wasn't out of obligation or chance, but because she wanted to, because somewhere along the way the wrong bride had become exactly the right one. And Caleb Rourke, a man who trusted little and expected less, closed his hand around hers like it was the one thing he knew he wasn't willing to lose.